Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Trevor Holt bought a crumbling beach house at auction, he thought he was getting a peaceful coastal escape. Instead, he stepped into a storm of obsession, forged documents, and a woman willing to burn it all down to reclaim a past that was never hers. This is how a house became a war zone. When I first pulled up to the crumbling shack that was now legally mine, the salt-heavy breeze off the Pacific hit me like a reminder. This wasn't Seattle anymore. The house, if you could still call it that, leaned slightly toward the ocean, its paint blistered off by decades of storms and indifference. The roof had bald patches where shingles once lived, and the porch slumped like an old drunk too tired to stand. But it had a view that made you forget every flaw. The sea opened up wide, endless, right from the front deck. And it was mine. I bought the place through a county auction, property seized over unpaid taxes, probably left to rot by some heir who didn't want to bother with it. The paperwork was all clean, title clear, taxes resolved, legal notices posted. I triple-checked everything before placing the winning bid. As a former coastal infrastructure engineer, I knew how these things could go sideways fast. This time, I was ready. 2 days after moving in, still sleeping on a cot and using a portable generator for light, I heard a knock, not a tap or a friendly neighborly knock. It was firm, like someone auditioning to be a battering ram. I opened the door, and there she stood, mid-50s, pressed blouse tucked into khakis, arms wrapped tightly around a worn cardboard box, hair sprayed into a helmet, smile nowhere to be found. "You Trevor Holt?" she asked without introducing herself. "I am," I said, half expecting her to ask if I wanted to buy Girl Scout cookies from a ghost. She lifted the box slightly, not offering it to me. "You're living in my family's house. I'll give you until the end of the week to vacate before I involve the police." I blinked. "I think you're mistaken." "No," she snapped. "This house belonged to my Aunt May. It was supposed to stay in the family. There's been a mistake at the county office, and it's being rectified as we speak. You're Karen, right?" I guessed. I'd seen her name in some old HOA meeting minutes during my research. Karen Beckwood. Used to be secretary for the local property division. Her lips twitched upward for a second, like she wasn't sure if I was insulting her. "Correct. And you need to understand something. This property was stolen through bureaucratic incompetence. You might have a piece of paper, but this house? This land? It's part of my family." I crossed my arms, trying not to laugh. "Karen, I bought this through a public auction. The county owned it after your aunt defaulted on the taxes. The sale was legal. The title is clean. This house was abandoned for over 20 years. That paperwork is meaningless," she said. "You think you can just swoop in and take something that should have stayed with blood?" My aunt didn't know what she was signing when she gave it up. I leaned against the warped door frame and gave her a long look. If your aunt was mentally incompetent when she signed legal documents, that's a matter for the courts. Not my porch. Her eyes narrowed like I'd just insulted her entire bloodline. "I'll be back with proof, and you'll wish you hadn't gotten involved in something that doesn't concern you." Before I could respond, she turned on her heel and marched back across the patchy lawn to a white Lexus parked just beyond the cracked driveway. She didn't look back. Just drove off like she'd already won something. I went back inside and stared at the box she left on the porch. Family photos, old Polaroids of beach barbecues, a couple of postcards from the 80s with "Love May" scribbled in blue ink. It was personal, sure, but none of it changed the title deed in my desk drawer. Still, I left the box untouched. I wasn't interested in rubbing salt in anyone's wounds. I just wanted to fix the place up, maybe turn it into a quiet getaway or a high-end rental. I didn't expect to be caught in some weird generational grudge match. The sun dipped low that evening, painting the sky in gold and blood orange. From the deck, it was breathtaking. I took it in, hands in my pockets, wondering if this was the last peaceful night I'd have in my so-called dream home. The next morning, I drove into town to check on building permits. I wasn't ready to start full-blown reconstruction, but I figured reinforcing the porch and securing the foundation couldn't hurt. The woman at the city planning office smiled when I handed her my application until she tapped a few keys and frowned at her screen. "Huh? That's odd." "Please don't say that," I said, half joking, half praying. She turned the monitor slightly, showing me the property registry database. Next to my parcel number, highlighted in soft yellow, was a red flag, subject to ownership dispute. Temporary title freeze, under review. What the hell is that? I asked, heart beginning to thud. It means someone submitted a challenge against the recorded title. It's probably nothing, just a procedural hiccup, but it puts everything on pause until legal review clears it. You'll get a notice in the mail. I stared at the screen, the cheerful blue interface suddenly feeling like a punch in the gut. Who filed the challenge? She hesitated. That's not listed here, but if it was filed, the county assessor's office will have the petition on record. You can request a copy. Back outside, I stood under the weak Oregon sun, reading the email confirmation that no work, electrical, structural, or otherwise, could proceed until the dispute was resolved. No contractors, no material deliveries, no progress. It didn't take a genius to figure out who was behind it. I drove to the assessor's office, requested the file, and sat in a corner flipping through the pages. There it was, petition to challenge transfer of title filed by Karen Beckwood. Her claim stated that the original deed transfer from her aunt 2 decades ago had been executed while the elderly woman was under diminished mental capacity and heavily medicated. Karen alleged the sale was exploitative and that her aunt had never intended to relinquish the property. Attached was a personal affidavit from Karen and, this really made me scoff, a character reference from someone in the county registrar's department, a colleague, friend, or both. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Her aunt had died in 2004. The sale happened in 2002, and here we were in 2025, revisiting it like it was fresh trauma. By noon, I had my lawyer, Marissa, on the phone. She was a friend of a friend from Seattle, sharp, meticulous, and probably more cynical than me. After I explained the situation, she let out a long sigh. Well, Trevor, the good news is your title's clean. The bad news is that doesn't stop someone from throwing mud on the wall to see what sticks. A challenge like this doesn't reverse ownership, but it stalls everything until the court dismisses it. How long? Could be 6 weeks. Could be 6 months. Depends on the county and the judge and how petty your neighbor is. I leaned against the rusted railing of my deck, watching seagulls fight over scraps below. She's definitely petty, I muttered. Then we're in for a ride, Marissa said. That night, I canceled the contractor I'd lined up and texted 2 others to hold off. Without permits, I couldn't legally touch the foundation, couldn't install plumbing. Hell, I wasn't even sure if putting up a gutter would count as a violation. The house sagged like it felt the weight of Karen's vendetta, and I did too. A day later, an envelope slid under my door. No stamp, no address, just my name in messy cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper, photocopied from some local newsletter decades old. It showed a photo of Karen's aunt, May Beckwood, longtime resident of Oceanside Drive, smiling in front of the very house I now owned. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink, "This is still ours." I stood there for a while, holding that piece of paper and wondering how deep Karen was willing to dig into the past to rewrite the present. I wasn't going to let a bureaucratic speed bump stop me, not after everything I'd already poured into this. The next morning, I climbed into the bed of my truck and started unloading lumber. If I couldn't renovate, I could reinforce. I wasn't about to let the entire porch cave in just because Karen had connections and a chip on her shoulder. The crew I'd originally hired had backed out the second they saw the dispute flag. Liability issues, they said. Understandable. But I found 2 local guys, independent, cash-friendly, no strangers to county red tape. We worked slow and careful, just stabilizing the joists and patching exposed beams. Nothing major, nothing permanent, but enough to keep the place from collapsing during the next storm. We'd barely started when the first patrol car rolled up. 2 officers stepped out, one in his 50s, the other a bored rookie, barely old enough to shave. Karen's white Lexus sat parked up the road like a queen watching her pawns. "Morning, gentlemen," the older officer said, adjusting his belt. "We got a call about unauthorized construction." "Maintenance," I corrected, wiping my hands on a rag. "Not construction. The deck's structurally compromised. It's not safe." He raised an eyebrow. "You got a permit?" "I've got a property title." "Permit's on hold because of a disputed claim. Completely baseless." Karen strolled up like she'd just been waiting for her cue. "Officers, this is the man I told you about. He's tampering with a property that's under legal review. That house has belonged to my family for generations." The rookie scribbled something on his notepad. The older cop looked at me. Can you prove you're the current owner? I walked over to the truck, pulled the folder from the glove box, and handed over a copy of the deed. Legal, signed, stamped, dated, clean. He flipped through the pages slowly, then handed it back. Well, Miss Beckwood, it looks like he's the current legal owner. Karen's jaw clenched. But there's an active investigation. He's not supposed to alter anything. He hasn't broken the law, the officer said, voice flat. Until the court says otherwise, it's his property. We're not arresting anyone today. That last word, today, hung in the air like a loaded gun. After they left, Karen stood at the edge of my driveway, arms folded, her eyes locked on me like a sniper targeting a heartbeat. She didn't say another word, just turned, got in her car, and peeled off like the pavement had offended her. I should have taken the warning more seriously. 2 mornings later, I pulled up to the house to find half my temporary fencing gone. Someone had sawed through the posts, leaving jagged edges behind like broken teeth. One of my workers stood by the debris, shaking his head. She told me we were trespassing, he muttered. Said we were working on stolen property. You get that on video? He nodded and pointed to a GoPro on his dash. Yeah, it didn't stop her, though. I reviewed the footage later. There she was, in a sun hat and gloves, holding a reciprocating saw like she was pruning roses. She looked right at the camera, smiled, and said, "You'll thank me when the truth comes out." I sent the footage to Marissa. Her reply came quick. "This is good, real good, but don't expect immediate justice. She's bold. Bold people are rarely careful. Let's keep the cameras rolling." That night, I walked the perimeter with a flashlight, every creak of the wind sounding like footsteps. The house groaned, old bones aching. Part of me admired Karen's persistence. Most people threaten legal action. She went straight to demolition. I wasn't sure if she was delusional, dangerous, or both, but I knew one thing. The longer this dragged on, the more personal it was getting. I thought I understood escalation. I'd seen coastal cities try to hold back the Pacific with sandbags and wishful thinking, but nothing I'd witnessed in infrastructure work compared to the slow-motion insanity Karen was unleashing on my life. After the fence incident, I upgraded my camera system, motion-triggered, night vision, cloud backup. I also started sleeping with one eye open. Karen hadn't just crossed a line, she'd torn it down with a power tool. The county still hadn't moved on the title dispute. My lawyer had filed a formal rebuttal, along with evidence that Karen's aunt had no cognitive impairments at the time of sale. But legal wheels grind slowly, and Karen wasn't waiting. Late Thursday night, I found something wedged between the boards of my deck. A photograph of Karen's aunt again, this time older, maybe just months before her death. Someone had scrawled on the back in ink, "She trusted us to keep this place sacred." Subtlety wasn't her strong suit. By Saturday, a storm rolled in. Nothing dramatic, just cold wind and sideways rain, but enough to test the newly braced porch. As I stepped outside to check on it, I spotted movement near the side yard. I turned just in time to see someone disappear behind the brush. I ran, flashlight cutting through the dark, but found nothing but muddy footprints and a cigarette butt, still warm. That's when I realized this wasn't about legal ownership anymore. Karen had decided to wage a psychological campaign. Subtle sabotage, veiled messages, lurking shadows. I reported the trespassing to the police. They filed a report and said they'd increase patrols, which meant they might drive by once a week if nothing else caught on fire. I didn't have to wait long. Monday morning, my workers showed up with bags under their eyes and one hell of a story. "She was here again," one said. 6 a.m., said the house was cursed now. "Tried to bribe us to leave. She offered me $200, the other added, and a handmade cross, like out of driftwood. I asked if they'd filmed her. They hadn't. Phones were inside their truck. But the way they told it, Karen had gone full cult leader, muttering about ancestral echoes and how I was inviting destruction. I didn't know whether to install more cameras or an exorcist. That night, I checked the footage from the east-facing camera and caught a blurry shot of her standing by the broken fence, holding something in her hands. She didn't move for nearly 5 minutes. Just stood there, staring at the house, breathing heavily. It would have been creepy if it wasn't so utterly absurd, but the absurdity ended the next night. I came back from town after grabbing supplies and noticed an acrid smell the second I opened my truck door. My stomach dropped. I raced to the back wall and found a blackened patch of siding, still warm, soot creeping up the boards. Someone had tried to light it up. It hadn't caught, thank God. Maybe the rain stopped it, maybe dumb luck. but it was unmistakable. Someone poured accelerant and lit a fire. I called the fire department and police. They confirmed it was intentional. But no prints, no cameras caught the angle. Just one charred spot on an old beach house, and a whole lot of suspicion. The officer gave me a look that said everything without saying a word. "You think she did it?" I asked anyway. He shrugged. "No proof, but you'd be smart to protect yourself." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went to town and bought a second-hand travel trailer, hauled it right up onto the property, and parked it under the pines. That was my new home. Until this nightmare was over. I wasn't leaving the place unattended again. And I wasn't waiting to catch her in the act. I was going to record every second until she slipped. Living out of a trailer on a storm-battered property wasn't exactly how I pictured my coastal escape, but between the arson attempt and Karen's daily performance art, I wasn't about to leave this house unattended again. I'd parked the trailer near a line of scraggly pines just far enough from the old house to give me a clear view of every approach. Cameras were up, motion lights installed, batteries charged. I wasn't just sleeping there. I was staking out. The days passed with a strange rhythm. I'd wake before dawn, coffee in hand, scanning the footage from the night before. Sometimes I'd catch raccoons. Once, a drunk teenager wandering too close to the beach. But most nights, it was quiet. Too quiet. Then came the Thursday. I was inside the trailer reviewing some old architectural plans on my laptop when the perimeter alarm pinged. West camera, porch side. I switched feeds. There she was. Karen, black hoodie, cargo pants, gloves. Her hair tied back tight like she was about to rob a bank, or maybe perform surgery. And she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, tall, heavyset with a hunched posture like his back carried a chip carved from concrete. He wasn't familiar, not one of the HOA types. He looked off. He was shouting, but the camera's mic only picked up a few words, garbled, angry bursts. Then suddenly, he sprinted at the front door like a linebacker. Crack. The door blew inward with one solid kick. Hinges bent. Splinters flew. I was already running. I burst out of the trailer, flashlight and taser in hand, boots sinking into damp soil as I crossed the yard. I heard crashing inside, furniture tossed aside. The man's voice echoed from the hallway. "This is ours. You don't get to take it." Karen's voice followed, shrill and triumphant. "We're reclaiming it." I didn't enter. I knew better than to confront a lunatic and his hype woman in the dark. I stayed outside, dialing the police, my voice calm but tight. "Yes, break in. 2 people. I have it on camera. I'm at 114 Ocean View. Hurry." Within minutes, headlights carved through the trees. 2 units arrived, lights flashing. The officers drew weapons and approached with protocol I'd seen only in movies. They ordered the intruders out. Karen emerged first, arms up, face smug. "This is a misunderstanding," she chirped. "We're family." The man followed, hands shaking, breathing hard. One of the officers cuffed him immediately. The other took Karen aside and asked her something off camera. Her face flickered, confidence cracking for a split second. I handed the officers a flash drive with the footage from the last 30 minutes. Karen's voice, her smile at the camera, the man's war cry, the kicked-in door. It was all there. The man, later identified as her cousin from Idaho, was arrested on the spot for forced entry, destruction of property, and resisting detainment. Karen wasn't cuffed, but she was warned. One more stunt, and she'd be facing criminal charges too. That wasn't enough. The next morning, Marissa and I filed a motion for a temporary restraining order, not just against Karen, but anyone acting on her behalf. We included the footage, the arson report, the fencing destruction, the false affidavits, every piece of madness she'd layered into this slow-burning war. The court granted it. Karen was legally barred from setting foot on my property. But something told me this wasn't her finish line, not by a long shot. You'd think that getting a court-ordered restraining order would buy you some peace. Turns out, it just shifts the battlefield. The day after the court papers were served, Karen vanished. Not literally, of course. Her car was still parked in the same spot up the hill like a white tombstone, but no more porch visits, no more boxes of family photos, no more ritualistic threats at dawn. For a minute, I almost missed her. Then the real paperwork started rolling in. It began with a thick manila envelope, slid into my mailbox like a dagger in a velvet sheath. Inside, a formal notice from the county clerk confirming that the court had frozen all title activity on my property pending resolution of the dispute. Karen had filed for an emergency hearing, arguing that the restraining order was unconstitutional harassment and interfered with sacred familial restitution. Sacred familial restitution. I didn't know whether to laugh or light the letter on fire, but Marissa was already ahead of it. She filed a countersuit, one that didn't just swat down Karen's claims, but launched a full-scale legal barrage. We filed for damages related to the forced entry, destruction of property, defamation, and emotional distress. We attached every shred of evidence, video stills, trespassing reports, statements from my contractors, and the fire report. Karen, as expected, lawyered up. Her attorney was a local guy with a face like a chalkboard and the charisma of a turnip. During our first preliminary hearing, he tried to argue that Karen had acted in the heat of emotional desperation and that her familial bond to the property superseded any temporary bureaucratic ownership. The judge blinked at that one, then asked slowly, "Are you suggesting that emotion invalidates legal property transfer?" Well, the attorney hedged. In cases where historical family property is involved. "Sir," the judge cut in, "this isn't Downton Abbey. This is the Circuit Court of Coos County. Sit down." Karen didn't speak during the hearing, but I watched her face. No panic, no remorse, just cold calculation, like she was waiting for her next move to land. After the session, I walked out into the brisk coastal air and found a folded note under my windshield wiper. No envelope, just my name in scrawled capital letters. "You'll regret this. I will never stop." For the first time in this whole twisted saga, I considered buying a gun. Instead, I doubled down. I hired a private investigator named Nolan, a retired detective with a voice like gravel and the patience of a glacier. Within days, he started digging. County archives, real estate logs, civil court filings. Karen had history. Turns out, mine wasn't the first property she tried to reclaim. Nolan uncovered 2 previous disputes. One in 2011, where she claimed her cousin had illegally sold a family lot to a developer. Another in 2019, an eerily similar case to mine, where she sued a man who'd purchased a foreclosed beach cabin that once belonged to her mother's sister. That case was dismissed after the court found forged notary signatures. Forged. That's when it all clicked. Marissa and Nolan started cross-referencing signatures from Karen's new affidavits with old public records. The difference was subtle, but to the trained eye, unmistakable. Her aunt's signature on a 2002 revocation document was a near-perfect match to one Karen had signed on a voter registration form in 2016. We compiled the evidence and handed it off to the district attorney's office. It was no longer a civil case. Now it was fraud. Real fraud. Criminal. With teeth. The DA promised to review the file personally. Said it might take a week. Maybe 2. I wasn't holding my breath, but I was holding my ground. The call came on a rainy Wednesday morning. I was elbow deep in cleaning out a decades-old drainage channel behind the house when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I caught the name on the screen, Marissa. "Trevor," she said, voice tight with purpose. "The DA's moving forward. Formal charges are being drafted. Fraud, forgery, attempted unlawful seizure of property. It's happening." For a second, I didn't respond. The sound of the rain, the ocean in the distance, and the weight of what she'd just said all blended into a kind of silence that didn't feel real. Then I laughed. Not out of joy, more out of disbelief that we'd finally crossed the threshold from crazy neighbor dispute into felony indictment. I met with Nolan that afternoon in a greasy diner near the courthouse. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of old property documents, side-by-side comparisons of signatures, witness statements from her previous victims, and a printout of her 2019 deposition, where she claimed under oath that her aunt never signed anything after 2000. The forged revocation form she used in my case was dated 2002. "You think it's enough?" I asked. Nolan sipped his coffee. "It's enough to bury her." Later that week, the district attorney filed formal charges, multiple counts of fraud, falsifying legal documents, and attempted real estate theft. Karen was summoned for a hearing, and when she failed to appear, claiming medical distress through her attorney, a bench warrant was issued. 2 days later, she was arrested outside her yoga studio. It made the local news. Small coastal towns don't get a lot of drama, so a 50-something woman being dragged out of warrior pose and into handcuffs was front-page material. They even used a mugshot. Karen looked stunned, disheveled, but somehow still smug, as if she believed the cameras were there to document her martyrdom. I didn't celebrate. Not really. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had finally turned. At the preliminary hearing, I sat across the courtroom from her, watching as the prosecutor laid out the pattern. 3 separate attempts over 15 years to reclaim properties sold through legal channels. All involved elderly relatives. All involved mysteriously resurfaced documents after long dormancy. And in every case, the common denominator was Karen Beckwood. Her attorney looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The judge denied bail. Too much risk of further tampering, they said. Karen was remanded to county custody pending trial. When they cuffed her and led her out of the room, her eyes locked on mine for just a second. No tears, no begging, just hate, cold and simple. I walked out into the parking lot and sat in my truck for a long time, watching the rain smear down the windshield, not thinking, not planning, just breathing. Marissa called that evening to let me know the restraining order had been upgraded to a permanent injunction. No contact, no proximity, no exceptions. She's going away for a while, Marissa said. 11 counts. Even with a deal, she's facing serious time. I thanked her and hung up. That night, for the first time in months, I slept straight through. No alarms, no prowlers, no midnight pacing, just the wind and the surf and silence. With Karen behind bars, you'd think the story was over. That's where most tales like this end, with the villain in cuffs and the hero riding off into some coastal sunset. But in real life, aftermaths are just new fronts in the same war. And I wasn't about to let the past 6 months of insanity just evaporate. The next few weeks were a blur of court filings and interviews. My lawsuit moved forward, civil now, but packing every ounce of weight the criminal case had cracked open. Marissa filed for full compensation, damages to the property, emotional distress, loss of rental income, and legal fees. We had receipts for everything, literally and figuratively. But the surprise came when the DA's office contacted me again. Trevor, the assistant prosecutor, said, "We've reviewed Karen's financials. She didn't act alone in everything." I sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" "She had help, someone on the inside, that registrar contact who flagged your title. We subpoenaed their email records. There's been a pattern of dispute flags placed without proper verification, and not just on your property." My jaw tightened. Karen's little crusade wasn't just personal. It had a support network. That realization hit harder than I expected. Turns out Karen had weaponized her history in the city planning office to manipulate the system from within. A few friendly names, a well-placed flag or comment, and suddenly properties became disputable, stalled, or frozen, just long enough to pressure, sue, or intimidate the owners into backing off. The prosecutor added, "We're opening a broader investigation. You're not her only victim." Nolan confirmed it a few days later. He found a paper trail, subtle, spread over years, like drops of ink on dry wood, but undeniable. Other homeowners, other beach lots, all with sudden title issues, all just outside the margins of legal challenge. One man, a retired commercial fisherman, had nearly lost his shack in 2014 before a judge dismissed Karen's claim. He came forward when the news hit. So did a widow from 3 towns over who'd fought Karen off with the help of a public defender and pure spite. And then there was a 2019 case, one I remembered vaguely from local gossip when I first visited the area. A tech entrepreneur bought a small ocean view cabin only to be bombarded by anonymous legal challenges and accusations of improper acquisition. He fought for over a year before the case was quietly dropped. That cabin, it once belonged to Karen's mother's cousin. Suddenly, a picture came into focus. Karen hadn't just been trying to reclaim family property. She'd built a mythology around it, a personal war. A fantasy where bloodlines overrode laws and every lost house was a theft waiting to be reversed. She wasn't just a manipulator, she was a zealot. The DA moved to expand charges, adding counts of conspiracy, document tampering, and obstruction. Karen's lawyer, sensing the floor collapsing beneath them, offered a deal, partial admission in exchange for reduced sentencing. But the DA refused. "There's a pattern here," he said, "and we're going to expose it." Meanwhile, I was preparing for the civil trial. Karen's assets were frozen. Her home, ironically, one she'd inherited from a cousin she barely spoke to, was under review for forfeiture. And her face was now familiar in the community for all the wrong reasons. Neighbors who once smiled politely now crossed the street when they saw her name in the news. HOA members resigned. The registrar she'd manipulated was placed on administrative leave. And me? I kept showing up to court, calm, patient, focused, When I took the stand during a preliminary hearing, the judge asked me plainly, "Why pursue a civil case, Mr. Holt, when criminal charges are already underway?" I looked around the courtroom, quiet, gray, full of people with pens and polite faces, and said, "Because I want a public record that she didn't just break the law. She tried to rewrite history." No one objected. The courtroom buzzed with low voices as the trial finally opened. Local reporters filled the back rows, laptops open, waiting to file stories with titles like "Coastal Con Woman Faces Justice" and "From Family Heirlooms to Felonies." I sat in the front, flanked by Marissa and Nolan, watching Karen shuffle in wearing a pale gray suit that couldn't quite hide the orange beneath it. Her hair was flat, her face gaunt, but her eyes still burned with that same righteous fire, like she still believed the whole thing was a misunderstanding we'd eventually apologize for. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid it all out like a roadmap through a minefield. The forged documents, the manipulation of county records, the pattern of false claims against multiple properties, the witnesses who'd been harassed, pressured, even followed. They brought up her past cases, the consistent handwriting anomalies, the suspicious timing of rediscovered deeds. One by one, the other victims took the stand. A soft-spoken widow, a weary old fisherman, even that stoic entrepreneur who'd flown in just to testify. Their stories weren't carbon copies, but they rhymed. Each had faced a Karen-shaped storm of legal chaos and intimidation under the thin guise of family heritage. Then came the digital evidence. Video clips of Karen sawing my fence, her cousin breaking in, the porch monologues, the "this is still ours" notes. Every piece painted the same picture. This wasn't grief. It wasn't confusion. It was entitlement weaponized through bureaucracy. When I took the stand, I didn't dress it up. I told them what happened, how I bought the house through a public auction, how I tried to rebuild it, how I was stalked, sabotaged, and nearly burned out of it, and how it wasn't just about a house, but about what happens when the law bends to people who scream the loudest. Karen didn't look at me during my testimony. She stared at the table, like if she focused hard enough, maybe it would vanish. Her defense? Thin as tissue. Her lawyer tried to lean on the same tired argument. Emotional trauma, familial misunderstanding, the complexities of generational property. He even tried to evoke sympathy, mentioning her years of public service and her close relationship with her late aunt. But the jury wasn't buying it. After 2 days of deliberation, they came back guilty on all counts. 11 felony convictions: fraud, forgery, attempted unlawful seizure, obstruction, and criminal conspiracy. The sentence was swift and severe: 11 years in state prison with no eligibility for parole before year 7. Fines stacked up like dominoes. Reparations to every victim, including me. The judge's tone was measured but sharp. "Your actions weren't a mistake," he said. "They were calculated, repeated, and masked in the language of grief to justify criminal behavior. This court rejects the idea that familial nostalgia is a license to terrorize others." Karen stood motionless, lips pressed so tight they vanished. For once, she had no comeback. After the verdict, a few people came up to shake my hand. Others just nodded, quiet recognition from a town that had watched her for years, unsure of how to stop her. Now they knew. When I walked out into the bright Oregon afternoon, I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. Like the house and I had both survived the same storm, and we were still standing only because we refused to fall. The next morning, I drove to the edge of town where a metal shop custom-made signs. I handed the welder a sketch and told him I wanted it clean, simple, with just the right amount of irony. 3 days later, it was bolted to the porch rail. "This is not your family house, Karen." The wind came in steady off the Pacific that morning, cool and clean, ruffling the linen curtains of the newly restored living room. I stood at the edge of the deck, coffee in hand, watching the waves roll in like slow, deliberate applause. For the first time since I bought this place, there was no weight in my chest, no dread, no waiting for the next disaster. The restoration had taken months, but the house finally stood straight. New siding, reinforced foundation, real insulation. Solar panels on the roof, and reclaimed wood accents inside that gave it a warm, weathered charm without the rot. I even had the original beach stone fireplace restored, just the way it looked in one of Karen's old photos, ironically enough. The sign still hung from the porch rail, polished brass now. This is not your family house, Karen. Tourists loved it. Locals smiled. The Airbnb listing got bookmarked more than 100 times in the first week alone. And then came the message from a local wedding coordinator. She'd seen the listing, loved the coastal view, the private access, the open deck, asked if I'd consider renting it out for intimate ceremonies. I told her I'd think about it. 10 minutes later, I called back and said yes. Within the month, the first couple stood under a driftwood arch where my half-collapsed fence used to be, exchanging vows as gulls cried overhead and the ocean hissed in approval. I watched from the trailer. I still kept it on the property out of superstition or sentiment. I wasn't sure. The money from those bookings started flowing in fast. More than enough to cover every dime I'd spent on the house, the lawyers, the investigator, and after that, profit, clean, earned, tangible. I kept Nolan on retainer. Not for Karen, she wouldn't be out for years, but just in case some new ghost decided this place belonged to them. Once bitten and all that. Marissa sent a bottle of champagne with a sticky note that read, "Don't spend it all on security cameras." But what surprised me most were the letters. Handwritten ones, emails, even a voice message or two. Other homeowners, victims, strangers who read about the case in some viral recap and saw a piece of themselves in it. People who'd been bullied by someone louder, richer, or better connected, and had given up. One woman wrote, "You proved that paper trails matter, that the system isn't just smoke. Thank you." Another, "Your house isn't just yours. It's a win for all of us." I didn't know what to say to that. Still don't. I don't think of myself as a crusader. I bought a house. I wanted peace. I got a war, and I fought because I had no other choice. But I'll admit, there's something satisfying about knowing Karen's story didn't end with her lie. It ended with the truth, nailed down, recorded, printed, and signed by a judge. Sometimes justice doesn't come easy. Sometimes it comes with charred siding, forged documents, and a woman shouting, "This is our house," while being hauled off in handcuffs. But sometimes it comes. And when it does, it's worth every goddamn nail.